You know that thing when you're holding something ordinary, like a tin of beans or a phone or a steering wheel, and for a second, for no obvious reason, your hand goes a little strange. Not numb exactly. You're still holding the object, but something in the arrangement has slipped. The hand is there, the thing is there, the task is still happening, but being a person in a body suddenly feels less automatic than it did a moment ago. Then it passes. You put the tin in the basket, you keep driving, and you go back to being someone with a name, a set of responsibilities, and a few unresolved anxieties. But for a second there, something was visible. Not a soul or a stable self, more like a process, a hum underneath the usual story. Psychology often wants the self to be manageable, something with an origin story that you can trace backwards through childhood, family, repression, trauma, shame, desire, and all the other furniture we drag around inside us without remembering who bought it. Stanislav Grof did not think the self was quite that simple. He was a psychiatrist first, born in Prague in 1931, trained at Charles University, and later awarded a PhD by the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences. Grof began inside psychoanalysis, all that stuff around childhood and repression and interpretation, useful and powerful and limited whenever it mistook its own language for the edge of reality. Then in the early 1960s, while working at the Psychiatric Research Institute in Prague, Grof encountered LSD. What came back through that chemical doorway didn't behave quite as politely as he would have liked. His patients were not only reporting childhood memories or symbolic dreams, they were reporting death, birth, mythic landscapes, ancestral presences, bodily dramas from somewhere older than personal biography. Some described being crushed in a tight canal, fighting towards light and knowing with terrifying certainty that they were not imagining it. They were reliving it in the body. On the floor of a supervised clinical session in communist Czechoslovakia, with a researcher watching, consciousness started behaving as if the normal story of the self was only the top layer. Grof spent the rest of his life trying to understand what had come through that door. He built a cartography of the psyche that moved beyond biography into birth and archetype and spiritual crisis, and the strange symbolic weather of non-ordinary states. Some of it was brilliant. Some of it remains deeply questionable. He took very seriously the possibility that the unconscious is not just a private cupboard full of childhood material. It may be stranger than that, wilder than that, and far less personal. Not a tidy basement under the house of the self, but something closer to an underground city, badly lit, partially flooded, and still occupied. So today we are stepping into the work of Stanislav Grof, into psychedelic therapy, holotropic breathwork, transpersonal psychology, and the difficult question of what happens when ordinary identity begins to come apart. When the self loosens and something underneath starts moving, what do we do with the thing that rises? Let's kick off in Prague, 1957. Stanislav Grof qualifies in medicine at Charles University and enters a psychiatric world that already thinks it knows where the unconscious lives. Psychoanalysis has been shaping the field for decades, and its basic promise is seductive because it gives suffering a plot. The symptom has an origin, the dream has a meaning, the trauma has a childhood attached to it. The analyst listens, interprets, connects the dots, and the patient slowly reconstructs the story. That's the psychotherapeutic contract. Grof trains in that world. He sits with patients, he listens to free association, he follows symptoms back through early experience, family atmosphere, desire, all the family furniture of psychoanalytic thought. Now, there's a real power in that approach. It gives language to pain, it gives shape to confusion, and it can help a person see that the thing ruining their life didn't appear from nowhere. But any system, if you stay inside it long enough, starts to reveal its edges. Grof began to notice that some experience didn't behave like ordinary personal memories. They weren't just too intense, they were too strange, too large. They didn't settle when interpreted, and they didn't return to childhood and wait to be explained. They seemed to move past the usual material down into something harder to name. And then, of course, LSD entered the room. This is the realm of the psychonauts, after all. Now, this isn't the summer of love kind of shit. There were no beads or incense or half-naked Americans attempting enlightenment through interpretive flailing. Czechoslovakia in the early 1960s was a communist state behind the Iron Curtain, and the psychedelic research taking place there was very clinical, very state-funded, and very methodical. Communist methodical. Grof became principal investigator of a program at the Psychiatric Research Institute in Prague, studying the therapeutic and heuristic potential of LSD. Heuristic, I do like that word, I should use it more often. He had protocols and dosing schedules. He had a research team, institutional oversight. He wasn't trying to turn anyone on, tune anyone in, or spiritually redecorate the planet. He was trying to understand what a powerful psychoactive substance did to the human psyche under controlled conditions. What he did, however, was create himself a problem. In supervised sessions with measured doses and careful observation, Grof's subjects began reporting experiences that didn't fit the standard psychoanalytic script. They weren't only describing childhood scenes or family dramas or some symbolic dreams. They were describing death, rebirth, enclosure, suffocation, pressure, encounters with presences that felt archetypal rather than personal. Some spoke about ancestral memory. Others described dissolving into something non-human or falling into a darkness that felt older than their own life. From the outside, the scene wouldn't have looked especially mystical. A person lies on a couch in a room in Prague. A researcher's present, the dose has been recorded. There are forms to complete, this is communist Czechoslovakia after all, observations to make, timings to note. Then, an hour or two later, the person is shaking, their breathing changes, their hands grip the edge of the couch or pull in towards their body. They are not talking about a difficult conversation with their father. They are describing being trapped inside a membrane, pressed from all sides by a force that has no face and no language. They say they are dying. They say they are being born. They say they can see the history of life opening in front of them. This is the moment where Grof's work enters psychedelic history. He's not just watching people hallucinate, he's watching the categories he inherited begin to fail in real time. The language of psychiatry is still close at hand, but the material coming through doesn't seem interested in behaving like a symptom he would expect. Grof published his work, he presented findings, he tried to shape what he was seeing into something that psychiatric language could hold. In 1965, he completed his PhD at the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences. 2 years later, a scholarship from the Foundation's Fund for Research in Psychiatry brought him to America, to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where he was invited by the psychiatrist Joel Elks to the Henry Phipps Clinic as a clinical and research fellow. America had given him a larger stage, but it hadn't given him a simpler problem. In 1969, Grof became chief of psychiatric research for the Spring Grove experiment, working alongside Walter Panker, the psychiatrist, and again, if I get the names wrong, you can just flail at me in the comments, the psychiatrist who conducted the famous Good Friday experiment on mystical experience and psilocybin. Grof was also appointed assistant professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. Now, these were serious institutions with serious people doing serious work. It can be easy, I think, to flatten the whole story at this point into counterculture fog. I'm only on Act 1 and I'm fucking up already. Grof wasn't standing on this festival stage promoting cosmic rebirth to anyone with a trust fund and a loose afternoon. He was a researcher moving between institutions, sessions, patients, and data that kept refusing to stay where it had been put. At Spring Grove, the pattern continued. LSD sessions produced material that didn't seem merely biographical. People reported experiences that felt perinatal, transpersonal, spiritual, and symbolic all at once. Some seemed to relive what they understood as the birth process with an intensity that moved through the whole body. Others encountered imagery that looked less like personal memory and more like religion or dream architecture dragged up from some older basement of the mind. Grof sat with hundreds of these sessions. He listened, he took notes, and he tried, at least at first, to place what he was seeing inside the psychological models he'd been trained to use. The models didn't break all at once. That's not usually how a worldview collapses. It bends first, it makes exceptions, it quietly expands its definitions. It tells itself that the strange material is only another symbolic expression of something familiar. Then one day there are too many exceptions on the table, and the system that once looked elegant starts to look more like a room with walls pushed out by the pressure from the other side. The therapist expects the unconscious to behave like a personal archive. Under LSD, at least in Grof sessions, it began behaving like something much less obedient. A womb, a battlefield, a theatre with the curtains on fire and no one in the lighting box admitting responsibility. There are two ways to respond to this. One is to say that these experiences were meaningless chemical events, the brain misfiring under a powerful psychoactive. Strange, dramatic, perhaps therapeutically useful in places, but not evidence of anything deeper. The other is to ask whether the inherited picture of the psyche was too narrow to hold what people were actually reporting. Grof chose the second path, and that choice would define the rest of his life. It would move him from the clinic into the centre of transpersonal thought, from Prague to Baltimore to Big Sur, from responsible psychiatric research into territory many of his colleagues wouldn't touch with someone else's you-know-what. It would make him one of the most important and most contested figures in modern psychology. But standing in those rooms, watching people shake, cry, laugh, dissolve, and return with stories that sounded impossible but felt clinically unavoidable, Grof couldn't yet see the full arc of what he was entering. He only knew that something had come through the doorway. And once it had come through, pretending the door was still closed was no longer an honest option. By the 1970s, Grof had reached a point every serious researcher both fears and secretly wants. The data had stopped behaving. It had gone past childhood memories and symbolic dreams, past the neat furniture of psychoanalysis, into birth, death, mythology, bodily terror, ancestral memory, and states of consciousness that made academic language look suddenly underdressed. So of course, Grof built another model. In 1973, he was invited to the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. Esalen sat on a cliff above the Pacific where the human potential movement gathered to stretch, breathe, confess, meditate, argue, and occasionally mistake emotional intensity for wisdom. For Grof, Esalen was looser than Prague and less protected by institutional seriousness than Johns Hopkins, but it gave him room to follow experiences that didn't fit the old psychiatric language. That freedom had a cost, we'll get to that, but it also allowed a kind of attention that's hard to practice when everyone in the room is already trying to reduce the experience to a symptom. Grof's new picture of the psyche began with the biological level. Childhood, memory, loss, shame, family atmosphere, trauma, the emotional residue of having lived a life amongst other people. Now there's nothing shallow about that work. You talk about why you flinch when someone raises their voice or why a small criticism feels like being shoved into a pit. Slowly, a line appears between the life you're living now and the life that taught you how to survive. But Grof didn't think that was the whole person. In session after session, once the personal material had been worked through, people seemed to enter something older and more bodily. They were no longer saying, "This reminds me of my childhood." They were saying, "I'm being crushed, I cannot get out, I'm dying, I'm being born." Grof called this the perinatal level. He was influenced by Otto Rank, who had argued, that's a name, isn't it, Rank? This podcast is Rank, who had argued in the 1920s that birth itself was the original human trauma. I don't disagree. Grof took that idea and made it structural. He suggested that birth could leave an imprint on the psyche, not as ordinary memory, but as a bodily and symbolic pattern that might reappear in non-ordinary states. He described 4 basic perinatal matrices: the peaceful womb before labour, the onset of contractions where the enclosed world turns hostile and there's pressure without escape, the struggle through the birth canal with compression, suffocation, friction and movement towards an opening that cannot yet be seen, then release, emergence, air. Say that too quickly and it sounds absurd. Everyone secretly remembers being born, and adult suffering is just getting squeezed into existence with better language. Excellent. Put it on a tote bag next to the healing crystals. But Grof's claim was a bit more slippery than that. He wasn't saying people remember birth like a film stored behind the eyes. He was saying that under LSD and later in other non-ordinary states, people repeatedly entered patterns organized around enclosure, pressure, struggle, death, and release. Bodies contracted, people curled inwards. They described terror without an object, pressure from all sides, a feeling of being trapped inside something that wouldn't open. Then, sometimes they passed through it. Their breathing changed. Afterwards, some described the shift as if a buried part of their life had moved, not intellectually, but somewhere below thought. You can see why this was compelling. If you're shaking on the floor and someone says, "This is not random, your body is not betraying you, something is moving through you," that can feel like a mercy, but it can also become a trap. A powerful experience is already persuasive. It arrives through pressure in the chest, heat in the face, images that feel older than language. If someone then hands you a beautiful structure, the structure may not feel like an interpretation. It may feel like recognition. That is where discernment becomes difficult. There are two ways to read Grof's perinatal matrices. He may have noticed real patterns in the body and psyche that mainstream psychology had no language for, or he may have found what he was looking for, then built a system rich enough for new experiences to organize themselves around it. Beyond the perinatal, Grof described the transpersonal. Here, the individual self seems to stretch past its usual borders. People reported becoming animals, mythic figures, ancestors, strangers from other times, or forms of consciousness that didn't feel human at all. Some described past lives, some described collective suffering, some described cosmic unity or sacred presences. Grof didn't always insist these experiences were literally true. His more interesting claim was that they were psychologically real. A person may not literally become an ancient priest, a dying soldier, a wolf, or the grieving body of the planet, but the psyche may use those images because something in the person's life cannot be reached by ordinary autobiography. A symbol doesn't have to be factual to be powerful. Our dreams prove that every night. Picture the room. Someone lies on a mat while the music builds slowly around them. Their breathing has changed, their jaw is locked, their hands are tight. The sitter beside them doesn't rush in with an interpretation. They don't try to make it tidy. They stay close enough to keep the person safe and far enough away to let the experience unfold. That takes discipline because the temptation to explain is enormous. Therapists do it, spiritual teachers do it, friends do it over coffee with the confidence of people who once read half a book about attachment theory. We see someone in distress and we want to give it a shape, partly to help them and partly because their chaos makes us uncomfortable. At his best, Grof resisted that urge, but the same openness has a shadow. At Esalen, Stanislav and Christina Grof ran long workshops where people entered these states through breath, music, bodywork, and group support. For some, the work was transformative. For others, it may have been catharsis wrapped in cosmic language. And once a community has a shared language for these experiences, people start hearing that language inside themselves. The person has a powerful bodily release. Someone calls it perinatal. Someone says they shit themselves. The person sees an animal. Someone calls it transpersonal. The person feels terror in the body. Someone links it to birth. The experience now has a name, a place, a meaning. It fits. That can be relieving, but it can also close the door too early. The biographical level at least has checks. Not perfect checks, because memory's a dodgy little archivist with a drinking problem, but some checks at least. You can at least ask other people. You can compare records. You can notice whether an interpretation changes how someone lives. The transpersonal level has fewer guardrails. If someone says they became a Sumerian priest in a non-ordinary state, what exactly are you going to do with that? Can't exactly go back and ask someone from Sumeria. A model that can welcome almost any experience becomes emotionally generous and intellectually dangerous at the same time. It protects experiences that would otherwise be dismissed. It also protects interpretations that should probably be challenged. By the end of this phase of Grof's work, the old psychoanalytic room had been left far behind. The couch was gone. The analyst's neat interpretations were gone. In their place was a body on the mat, music rising, a sitter waiting nearby, and an experience too large to be comfortably called memory, fantasy, symptom, or revelation. Something was happening there. The trouble was knowing what to call it without turning the name into a cage. A powerful experience doesn't usually arrive all quiet-like. It arrives through the body first, through trembling, through heat in the face, through the hands closing without permission, through the sudden animal knowledge that something is happening before the mind has decided what it thinks. Someone lies on the floor of a session room, shaking hard enough that the people nearby fall quiet. Their knees pull in, their arms tighten. The sounds coming out of them don't belong to ordinary speech. The facilitator watches for a while, then said the body is releasing birth trauma. And once that sentence enters the room, it changes the room. It gives the terror a shape while the person is still inside it. Shaking becomes evidence, pressure becomes memory, collapse becomes process. The person may agree, not because they've weighed the claim, but because the experience is so total that doubt feels almost insulting. Their body is not debating, it is surviving something. Now this is where we get into Grof's work becoming dangerous outside of careful clinical conditions. The danger isn't strangeness. Dreams are strange. Grief is strange. Panic, sex, prayer, fever, exhaustion, love, all of them can make the ordinary self leak at the edges. The danger is what happens when someone else supplies the meaning too quickly. Non-ordinary states come soaked in conviction. The person who spent 90 minutes inside what felt like death and rebirth doesn't return as a detached observer. They return with the expression of someone who's been somewhere enormous, somewhere that made ordinary life look thin and badly lit. A thought can be argued with. A bodily event is harder to dispute. If your chest opened, if your breathing changed, if you sobbed from somewhere below language, if an image arrived with the force of a revelation, the question of literal truth can feel almost vulgar, like asking for a receipt at a funeral. Grof tried to hold a difficult line. Take non-ordinary states seriously without taking them literally too quickly. Honour the experience without handing the experiencer a cosmic license. It's the difference between listening to someone and recruiting them into a belief system. But his model had a weakness. It was too welcoming. A vision of Christ on the cross can be placed in the agony of the third perinatal matrix. A past life as a medieval monk belongs to the transpersonal level. A demonic presence can be spiritual emergency. A session with little unusual content can mean the person was defended, blocked, or not ready. The system can always find a draw for the thing. That generosity feels kind, but it makes challenge difficult. If every image has a place, every terror has a category, and every absence can be explained by hidden resistance, the model stops being a useful tool. The criticism of Grof's perinatal theory isn't that it sounds strange. Useful ideas often do sound strange before anyone knows what to do with them. The harder criticism is that the theory is difficult to falsify, and that the rooms where these patterns appeared were vulnerable to suggestion. The language is there before the session, the music shapes the emotional arc, the bodywork draws attention to particular sensations, the group has expectations, the participants read the books, heard the stories, absorbed the atmosphere, then the body produces something overwhelming. By the time interpretation arrives, it might already feel familiar. Developmental psychology raises another problem. The infant brain during birth is not a tiny documentary crew recording material for later playback. The hippocampus is not mature in the way adult memory would require. Whatever sensory material exists isn't the same as a coherent autobiographical memory waiting decades to be replayed under LSD. Critics push this hard. Susan Blackmore questioned whether a newborn would see anything like the tunnel imagery often linked to birth. Chris French noted that people born by caesarean section still report tunnel experiences during near-death states. Michael Shermer was blunter. There is no evidence for detailed infantile memories of this kind, and the physical realities of birth do not match the tidy symbolic version. I don't know if he was American or not, so I'm just doing that voice. Those criticisms are important, but there's a cold form of skepticism that fails in the opposite direction. It looks at someone in a non-ordinary state and says, only neurology, only suggestion, only hallucination, only noise. Go home, stop making it mystical, have a biscuit and try some CBT. That might be a nice tidy way to look at things, but it isn't enough when we're dealing with the unconscious. Even if the content isn't literally true, the suffering is real. The body has gone through something. Dismissing it as nonsense may protect the skeptic from embarrassment, but it doesn't help the person on the floor trying to come back into themselves. This is where Stanislav and Christina Grof's idea of spiritual emergency still has some force. Not every strange state should be crushed flat by diagnosis the moment it appears. Sometimes what looks like collapse can also contain movement if it's held properly. And there is the knife edge. Refuse to pathologize too quickly and you give someone room to heal. Wait too long and you may miss the moment when they need urgent help. Respect the sacred quality of a crisis and you may protect its meaning. Trust it too much and you may watch someone sink into a story so large they can't find their way out. Imagine someone after a retreat. They spent 3 hours in a converted chapel with 14 strangers, a wall of music and a facilitator whose confidence fills every pause. Their breathing changed, their bodies shook, their childhood seemed to connect with the cosmos, their grief became an animal, their fear took on a face. And then they go home. The sofa is still the sofa, the kettle still clicks off in the same tired way, the rent is still due. Their nervous system hasn't received the memo that the ceremony's over. Now they have a story. Perhaps it helps them to grieve. Perhaps it gives them enough courage to stop pretending they're fine. Or perhaps it becomes another enclosure, Another beautiful explanation they spend years trying to escape. The experience doesn't settle that question for them. The shaking doesn't prove the interpretation, the tears don't validate the model. The feeling of revelation doesn't guarantee that something true has been revealed. Everything can feel sacred, but the meaning can still be wrong. Grof's strength was that he refused to abandon the strange material. He wouldn't reduce it all to meaningless brain noise because it made psychiatry uncomfortable. But the shadow of that strength is the temptation to give every strange thing a place until the system becomes too complete to breathe inside. A useful map leaves blank spaces. It admits uncertainty. It lets the person stand there without being swallowed by the legend at the side of the page. By this point in the podcast, it would be easy to put Grof in a box and be done with him. The skeptic's box is tempting. The lid fits nicely. The perinatal matrices are difficult to prove. The memory claims do not sit comfortably with developmental psychology. The transpersonal material stretches far beyond what most scientists will be willing to defend. If you want to evaluate Grof only as a man who delivered a stable, empirically validated model of the psyche, then there's a short version of this episode where I probably stop at around the introduction, make a small noise of professional disappointment, and then go home. But that would miss something important. Now, the criticism isn't wrong, much of it is serious, and some of it lands pretty hard. Grof's specific claims don't all survive contact with careful scrutiny. Some of them wobble, some of them overreach, and some of them sound less like science and more like a mind trying to build something out of intense experience and then persuade the planning committee after the fact. Still, there's a reason his work refuses to disappear. Grof walked into rooms where people were having experiences that mainstream psychology just didn't know how to hold. They were contracting, sobbing, laughing, seeing, remembering, dissolving, and returning. Their suffering didn't arrive in complete sentences. It arrived through pressure in the ribs, heat in the face, a locked jaw, a hand pulling into a claw, a sound coming from somewhere the person didn't recognize as themselves. Now, most therapy is built around language. You sit in the room, or on these days on a video call with slightly unstable Wi-Fi, and you try to say the thing clearly enough that another human being can help you carry it. There's a real dignity in that. There's a relief in finally finding the sentence that's been hiding underneath the symptom for years. But language has edges. Sometimes the body knows before the mind has caught up. Sometimes grief isn't a thought but a weight. Sometimes fear isn't a belief but a posture. And memory comes back as a smell, a tightening, a flinch, a dream image, a refusal to breathe properly when nothing obvious is wrong. Grof's best work begins there, in the place where the talking runs out. He took seriously the possibility that the psyche speaks in more than words. It speaks in images, sensations, bodily dramas, symbolic scenes, and emotional atmospheres. That doesn't mean that every image is revelation. It doesn't mean that every tremor is trauma leaving the body in a neat little queue. The body is not a mystical printer producing certified documents from the Federal Department of Truth, but it does mean that experience can be meaningful before it's verbal. That's the thread that's worth keeping. After LSD research became legally and politically impossible, Stanislav and Christina Grof developed holotropic breathwork as another way of entering non-ordinary states. No psychoactive smuggled into the bloodstream like a tiny anarchist, just breathing, music, focused bodywork, and a carefully held setting. Now, on paper, that sounds almost too simple. Accelerated breathing, evocative music, a sitter nearby, a room where the usual social performance can loosen its grip. Yet under those conditions, some people report experiences that resemble the ones Grof had seen in psychedelic sessions. Bodily release, old grief, birth-like experiences, encounters with symbolic imagery, an emotional material that seems to arrive from below ordinary thought. Breath is strange in that way. It's the most ordinary thing in the world. You're doing it now, probably without being especially impressed by yourself. You've been doing it since the beginning of your life, and you'll keep doing it until the body closes the account. Most of the time, breath is background. It's the little engine note underneath the day. But change the breath, and the background can become a doorway. That doesn't make breathwork harmless. It's not a casual wellness hack, despite the wellness industry's remarkable talent for taking anything intense, ancient, or psychologically complex and turning it into a morning workshop with a discount code. You know I love wellness. You know I love the wellness industry. Grof-style breathwork can be powerful. It can destabilize people. It can open material that they are not ready to meet. It needs proper facilitation, careful screening, and an understanding that catharsis is not automatically healing just because someone cried hard enough to frighten the cushions. The important point is not that everyone should do it. The important point is that Grof saw altered states as capacities of the human organism, not just chemical events produced by unusual substances. The doorway wasn't only in LSD, it was also in rhythm, music, breath, attention, permission, and the strange intelligence of a body given enough safety to stop pretending. Picture the morning after a session. Not the cinematic version, someone glowing with cosmic wisdom writing a substack about ego death before breakfast. Just a person at a kitchen table, tired, quiet, a little bit raw around the edges. Their phone is face down, their chest feels different, not healed exactly, but less armoured in places. Something they've kept at a distance for years has moved closer. They don't know what it means yet. That's probably the more honest version of integration. It's not a new identity. It's not some revelation packaged for immediate public consumption. It's a small change in the way the body permits the person to feel their own life. Now we can't think of Grof as the man who solved the unconscious. He's useful because he asks us to listen differently, to notice that the psyche may speak through the body before it speaks through explanation, to stay with symbolic material without immediately flattening it into diagnosis or inflating it into cosmic certainty. That's a difficult discipline. Most of us do one of two things when the psyche gives us something strange. We dismiss it because it embarrasses our rational self, or we worship it because it feels larger than ordinary life. Grof's best moments live somewhere less comfortable. Take it seriously, but don't take it literally too quickly. Let the experience breathe before forcing it to become some doctrine. The psychonaut in this sense isn't just someone who takes substances. It's someone willing to enter difficult inner weather and return with enough humility to say, this happened, and I don't yet know what it means. Grof spent his life listening to reports from that weather. Some of the charts he drew were too confident, some of the borders were in the wrong place, and some of the names he gave things may have told us more about his model than about the mind itself. But he did the listening. And that's the part that's worth carrying forward. Not the need to believe every claim, but the willingness to sit beside an experience that doesn't fit and resist the cheap comfort of pretending it means nothing. There's a version of self-improvement that treats the psyche like software with a few bad lines of code. Track your sleep, measure your output, sort your symptoms into categories, notice the pattern, rename the pattern, optimize the pattern, then build a morning routine around making the pattern slightly less embarrassing in public. I mean, that's not useless, I suppose. Some of it helps. Sometimes the most merciful thing you can do for yourself is to eat properly, go outside for a bit, and stop pretending 4 hours of sleep is a personality, and then learn how to answer an email without turning it into a referendum on your worth as a human being. I mean, those things are handy. But there's a definite ceiling to that kind of work. Beneath the habits and the routines, beneath the little systems we build to keep ourselves functioning, there is still the part of us that wakes up in the morning with a feeling in the chest that has no name. The part that reacts before we've decided what we think. The part that flinches, grips, tightens, dreams, and refuses to be improved into silence. Grof spent his life trying to make contact with that part. Modern psychology, at least in its more popular forms, often becomes a surface project. It teaches us how to function better inside the life we already have, manage your anxiety, reframe your narrative, build healthier relationships, become more resilient, develop better tools. All fine, all good, all useful. I'm not above a tool. I've been held together by lists, coffee, and the occasional well-timed walk like any other moderately frayed adult trying to pass as a person. But the surface isn't the whole person. Grof didn't see the ordinary self as the final authority. He saw it as something small and visible, moving above the depth it barely understood. The conscious personality, the bit that answers emails and chooses what it wants for dinner and says I'm fine with the dead-eyed conviction of a hostage, isn't false exactly. It's just incomplete. You don't need to have taken psychedelics or done breakfast. Psychedelics or breakfast, both at once. You don't need to have taken psychedelics, done breath work, or sat in a circle in Big Sur to recognise what Grof was pointing towards, because you already know it in ordinary life. You know it from grief that arrives as weight behind the sternum and stays there long after everyone thinks you're coping. You know it from shame that floods the face with heat before the mind has found a single sentence to explain what happened. You know it from an old memory that returns as a smell, and suddenly you're no longer in the room you were standing in a second ago. You know it from the dream that bothers you for 3 days, not because you understand it, but because some part of you seems to understand it perfectly well and has chosen not to share the minutes of the meeting. You know it from the disproportionate reaction. The anger that's too large for the comment, the sadness that arrives too quickly, the fear that doesn't match the actual danger in front of you. On the surface, nothing much has changed. Someone used the wrong tone, a message went unanswered, a plan changed, a door closed a little too hard. But inside, something old has moved. The moment has brushed against a wound that was waiting in the dark with its coat still on. Some part of you spoke, just not in the language you were listening to. Now this is the real bit of Grof that I want to keep hold of. Not the need to accept every claim he made, or the birth matrices, or the idea that every difficult session is secretly a replay of the birth canal. Something simpler and slightly harder to sit with. The psyche has a symbolic life. The body stores things the autobiography leaves out. Grief has weight, shame has temperature, fear has posture, old pain has location, although often not where you expect to find it. The deepest material doesn't always arrive as a sentence you can deliver neatly in therapy. Sometimes it arrives as pressure, contraction, a sound from somewhere below speech, an image that opens under your feet like a trap door. To treat that as a glitch is to miss the voice inside it. That doesn't mean the voice is always wise. The unconscious is not some holy oracle. It lies, it distorts, it repeats, it mistakes old danger for present danger. It dresses trauma in symbols and acts offended when you ask for clarification. If you obey everything that rises from underneath, you'll end up living in the basement and calling it depth. But if you dismiss all of it, you cut yourself off from the material that may be trying, clumsily and painfully, to return you to yourself. Take the symbolic seriously without turning it into scripture. Let the body speak without assuming every word is literal. Stay close to the experience without handing it the keys to the fucking car. After the storm of an altered state, or grief, or panic, or a dream that leaves its fingerprints on the morning, a person may sit quietly and realize something has shifted. They are not enlightened, they are not fixed, they haven't been reborn into a better personality, but they are slightly more honest than they were before. That honesty may be small. It may look like admitting that a fear is older than the situation in front of them. It may look like recognizing that the body's been carrying a grief the mind declared finished months ago. Or it might look like noticing that the self they present to the world isn't the whole house. There are rooms underneath. Some have been locked for years, some are flooded. Some contain old furniture no one's dusted in decades, and the dust has settled so deeply into the fabric that it's become part of the cloth. Some contain nothing dramatic at all, just a weird smell that makes the throat tighten, a photograph turned face down, a sound from childhood that still knows exactly where to find you. Now, I don't think the work is to live down there. I think the work is to stop pretending that the lower rooms don't exist, and stop being surprised when something tries to climb up the stairs. The unconscious is not a machine waiting to be repaired. It is a living depth asking to be approached with courage, humility, and a very careful respect for how easily we can fool ourselves into thinking we've explained something when we've only named it. Grof drew imperfect plans of those lower rooms. He got some dimensions wrong, he labelled doors that might not have been doors at all, and sometimes mistook echoes for architecture. But at least he was willing to go down there and have a look, whilst many people preferred to stay upstairs, pretending the noises beneath the floorboards were nothing to worry about. Once you've heard something moving underneath the house, you can still choose not to go down there, but you can't honestly say the house is silent. Most of us only meet the deeper parts of the psyche by accident. A crisis, a dream, a grief that doesn't behave, a panic that arrives with no obvious object. Grof spent his life trying to stay in that moment. That was his gift, and also his danger. He didn't look away from experiences that frightened the clinician, embarrassed the skeptic, or made ordinary psychological language feel very underdressed. He sat with people as they cried, dissolved, returned, and tried to explain where they'd been. Then he built maps from what they brought back. Now, some of those maps were a bit too bold, and some drew roads where there really weren't any. Some turned personal pain into cosmic architecture far too quickly, and some gave names to experiences that might have needed more silence before they were labelled. Grof wasn't always right. We're not going to pretend otherwise. The psyche is already strange enough without polishing every turd into revelation. But the attempt is important, because there are experiences that don't fit inside ordinary language. There are forms of suffering that don't arrive as neat thoughts. There are moments when something in us speaks through birth, death, monsters, light, gods, rooms without doors, and sounds the mouth makes before the mind has decided what it means. When that happens, we tend to reach for one of two comforts. The first is dismissal. It was only neurology, only panic, only suggestion, only a dream. The word only carries a lot of work there. It lets us put the experience back in its box without asking why the box is about to explode. It lets us put the experience back in the box without asking why the box is shaking like a man trapped inside and trying to break himself free. The second comfort is surrender. The experience felt profound, so it must be true. It felt sacred, so it must be trusted. It felt larger than ordinary life, so ordinary life must now kneel before it and apologize for being so small. Both responses are understandable, but neither is enough. The harder thing is to remain with the experience without rushing to reduce it or worship it. To say, this happened, it's clearly important, but I have no idea yet what it means. To sit in the dark without immediately pretending the dark is empty, and without immediately turning every noise into the voice of God. Now this is where Grof leaves us. No certainty, no finished theory of the unconscious, no clean answer to whether the psyche is personal, biological, symbolic, spiritual, or some ungodly mixture of all of them. He leaves us at the threshold. I think this is the best place to leave Grof. Neither certainty nor dismissal, but the difficult discipline of listening with one hand still on the ground. Thank you, you beautiful lot, for tuning in today. Your time, your presence, and your attention are, as always, deeply appreciated. Now, if you want to keep cartographing the wreckage with me, you can find the show in all the usual digital purgatories. We're on TikTok, Instagram, and X with the handle @TheObservingEye. We are on YouTube at youtube.com/@TheObservingEye, and we are on Substack, which is the home of the podcast, at TheObservingEye.com. And of course, you can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever platform you use to deliver these episodes into your ear holes. You can also drop me an email at david@theobservingeye.com. I do read them, and I will do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. So if you want to recommend a subject for an episode, or you just want to say hi, you are very welcome to send me a message. We will be back next week, and we are continuing our Realm of the Psychonaut season. As always, I haven't worked out who I'm going to be covering next week, so it will be a surprise. Any suggestions? Let me know. I have a few suggestions already, so I'm going to go through the list as well. So thank you to all of you who sent those in. Very much appreciated. You're doing me a massive, massive help here. Until next week then, take care everybody. Much love. And I will catch you soon.